Racist cop arrest black woman, they got shocked when she's the judge presiding over their case. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the bustling city of Charleston as the first day of summer brought families to parks and children to playgrounds. Among the city's tranquil spaces, the shady corner of Sycamore Park became the site of an unexpected tension. On a polished bench near the duck pond, Judge Maya Monroe sat, enjoying a rare day off. Dressed casually in a light blue sundress, her demeanor exuded calm as she flipped through a thick legal book, a blend of work and leisure. Her dark curls framed a face known for its composure in the courtroom. A piercing siren shattered the serenity, drawing stares as a police cruiser swerved to a halt near the park's entrance. Two officers, identifiable by their crisp uniforms and mirrored sunglasses, stepped out with purpose. Conversations hushed, and joggers paused mid-stride, sensing an altercation brewing. Maya's focus was pulled from her book as the officers approached her bench. Their stiff posture and piercing glare suggested that she had become their target. Confusion flickered across her face, but she remained seated, her expression calm yet wary. "Ma'am," the taller officer began, his voice edged with suspicion. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Do you mind telling us what you're doing here?" Maya raised a brow, her grip tightening slightly on the book in her lap. "Suspicious activity," she repeated. "I'm enjoying a quiet morning in the park, if that's what you mean." The second officer's gaze swept over her belongings, a tote bag and the book she'd been engrossed in moments earlier. "May we see some ID?" he demanded, his tone brooking no argument. Maya's pulse quickened, though her demeanor remained composed. "I'm not sure why that's necessary," she said evenly, closing her book and setting it aside. "But if it'll help clarify things, of course." She retrieved her wallet, handing over her driver's license with deliberate calm. The first officer scrutinized it as though expecting it to reveal more than her name and address. "Maya Monroe," he read aloud, his tone flat but probing. "What brings you here, Ms. Monroe?" "As I said," she replied, her voice firming, "I'm enjoying a peaceful morning in the park." "Now, is there a problem?" The officers exchanged glances, their suspicion undiminished. "Mind if we search your bag?" the taller one asked. The question lingered in the air like a challenge, drawing murmurs from the growing crowd of onlookers. Maya met the officer's gaze steadily. "Without cause?" "Yes, I do mind. Unless you're prepared to explain why I'm being treated this way." Her refusal seemed to light a fuse. The officer's expression hardened as he reached for his handcuffs. "Refusing to comply, huh? You're making this more difficult than it has to be." The crowd's murmurs turned into audible protest as Maya stood, her dignity intact despite the rising tension. "If you're arresting me, I'd like to hear the charge," she said calmly. Without further explanation, the officers cuffed her, their movements brusque and rehearsed. As they led her toward the cruiser, her book laid abandoned on the bench, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Onlookers pulled out their phones, capturing the surreal scene. Through the car's tinted windows, Maya watched as the park receded behind her. Her jaw clenched as indignation simmered beneath her calm exterior. She had defended countless clients in similar situations, the irony was bitter and undeniable. Little did the officers know, the woman they had just humiliated was more than their equal, she was the judge they'd soon face in court. The air inside the cruiser was stifling, and the officers exchanged smug remarks, unaware of the storm they had just invited into their lives. Maya sat silently, her mind already crafting the response to their grave misstep. The wheels of justice had begun turning, and this time, she was both its engine and its reckoning. The cramped holding cell was a stark contrast to the serene park where Maya Monroe's morning had begun. Sitting on a cold metal bench, her wrists raw from the cuffs, she replayed the encounter in her mind. Each question, each dismissive glance, each unjustified accusation, all burned into her memory. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the otherwise silent cell. Yet, her mind buzzed with activity, mapping out the path ahead. Across town, the Fort Charleston Police Department buzzed with its activity. Officers moved through the halls, some blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the holding area. Others whispered about the suspicious woman from the park. The arresting officers, Mark and Ryan, sat smugly at their desks, confident they had neutralized another potential threat. Maya's release came hours later, her dignity bruised but intact. Stepping out into the crisp afternoon air, she was greeted by her colleague and close friend, Sophia Davis. Sophia's face was a mixture of concern and fury as she hurried over. "Maya, are you okay?" "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. Maya took a steadying breath, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm fine, but this isn't over," she said firmly, her voice carrying an edge of determination. "Not for me, and not for them." The two women drove to Maya's office, where the reality of what had transpired began to crystallize. As the door closed behind them, Sophia exploded. "This is outrageous. How dare they treat you like some criminal? Do they even know who you are?" Maya's lips curved into a small, humorless smile. "Not yet," she said, her tone clipped. "But they will." Sitting at her desk, Maya began drafting a formal complaint against the officers and the department. Her legal mind, honed over years of practice, moved with precision. She detailed every moment of the encounter, citing statutes and case law that highlighted the officers' overreach and bias. By the time she set down her pen, the document was a damning indictment of the events at Sycamore Park. Unbeknownst to her, a video of the arrest had already begun circulating online. Filmed by an onlooker at the park, it captured the officer's hostile tone, Maya's calm demeanor, and the crowd's growing unease. The footage quickly gained traction, sparking outrage across social media. The next morning, Maya awoke to a flood of messages. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers reached out with words of support and anger on her behalf. News outlets had picked up the story, labeling the incident a potential case of racial profiling. The spotlight was now firmly fixed on the Fort Charleston Police Department, and Maya's name was at the center of it all. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, whispers of the arrest spread among staff and attorneys. Most were unaware of Maya's ordeal until an email arrived, a formal announcement that she would be presiding over a new internal misconduct case involving two officers accused of excessive force. Maya's heart stopped as she read the names on the docket, Officers Mark and Ryan. Her breath caught, but only for a moment. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face before it was replaced by a steely resolve. Fate had handed her an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to confront the very men who had wronged her, not as a victim, but as an arbiter of justice. The air was thick with tension as Maya prepared for the hearing. Her black robe hung on the back of her chair, a symbol of the authority she had earned through years of perseverance. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she straightened her posture, smoothing her robe with deliberate care. "You faced worse," she murmured to herself. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation that morning. Reporters had gathered outside, their cameras ready to capture the latest development in what was quickly becoming a national story. Inside, lawyers shuffled paperwork, and the defendants arrived, their confidence visibly shaken as they realized the identity of the judge presiding over their case. Maya entered the courtroom with her usual poise, her presence commanding immediate respect. As she took her seat, her eyes briefly met those of Officers Mark and Ryan. The flash of recognition in their faces was unmistakable, and for the first time, they seemed to grasp the magnitude of their actions. "This court is now in session," Maya announced, her voice steady and authoritative. "Please be seated." The stage was set. The catalyst for change was in motion. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the case against Officers Mark and Ryan unfolded. The audience, a mix of journalists, community members, and legal professionals, watched with rapt attention. For Judge Maya Monroe, the morning had already been a test of resolve. Though her judicial demeanor was as composed as ever, the weight of the situation bore heavily on her. The prosecution began by presenting video evidence of the officers' misconduct, not just in the park incident but in other encounters. The footage painted a troubling picture, repeated instances of excessive force, unwarranted detentions, and clear racial profiling. As the prosecutor's words reverberated through the room, Maya's focus sharpened. Each new piece of evidence deepened the complexity of the case and the personal stakes. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, turning toward Maya, what we see here is not an isolated incident, but a pattern of abuse, a flagrant disregard for the principles of justice and equality that law enforcement is meant to uphold. Maya nodded, her expression neutral. Inside, her emotions churned. The prosecutor's words were a painful reminder of the injustices she had worked so hard to combat in her career. But this wasn't about her. It was about justice. When it was the defense's turn, the lead attorney wasted no time attempting to discredit the evidence. Your Honor, he argued, the videos show moments taken out of context. Policing is an inherently difficult and high-stakes profession. These officers acted based on their training and the circumstances they faced at the time. Maya's gaze flickered briefly to Mark and Ryan. Both men sat stiffly at the defense table, their earlier arrogance replaced by unease. They avoided eye contact with her, their confidence eroded by the mounting evidence. The day's testimony brought forward witnesses whose stories mirrored Maya's own experience. One by one, community members recounted their encounters with the officers, their voices trembling with a mix of anger and pain. An elderly man described being stopped while walking home from church. A young mother tearfully detailed how her teenage son had been detained without cause. They told him he fit the description, she said, clutching a photo of her son. But the only thing he fit was their bias. Maya listened intently, her hands clasped tightly as she absorbed each account. With every testimony, the courtroom's atmosphere grew heavier. The defense attempted to push back, suggesting that the witnesses were exaggerating or misremembering events. But the cracks in their narrative widened with every rebuttal. During a recess, Maya retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. She had faced difficult cases before, but this one felt deeply personal. The line between her role as a judge and her own experience was growing increasingly blurred. Staring out the window, she took a steadying breath. You can't lose focus now, she told herself. As proceedings resumed, the defense called Mark to the stand. His testimony was a masterclass in evasion. He spoke in measured tones, framing his actions as necessary responses to ambiguous situations. I never intended to target anyone unfairly, Mark said, his voice steady but lacking sincerity. We operate in high-pressure environments. Mistakes happen. Maya's pen paused mid-note. Mistakes. The word lingered in her mind. What she had endured wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate misuse of authority. When the prosecutor cross-examined, Mark's composure faltered. Officer Mark, the prosecutor began, are you suggesting that detaining individuals without cause falls under mistakes? Mark hesitated. I followed protocol as I understood it at the time. The prosecutor's eyebrows rose. And yet, in multiple cases, your protocol disproportionately impacted minority individuals. Can you explain that? Mark's silence spoke volumes. As the trial progressed, Maya noticed subtle shifts in the courtroom dynamic. The audience's initial curiosity had turned to outrage. The weight of systemic issues, the implicit biases, the unchecked power, was laid bare for all to see. Maya adjourned the day's session, her gavel striking with a sharp finality. As the room emptied, she remained seated, staring at the bench before her. She had always believed in the system's ability to deliver justice, but today had exposed just how much work remained. That evening, Maya attended a community forum, where locals gathered to discuss the case and its implications. She stood at the back, blending into the crowd as people shared their fears and frustrations. This isn't just about these two officers, one man said, his voice rising with emotion. It's about a system that lets them act this way in the first place. Maya's chest tightened. He was right. Her role wasn't just to decide the fate of two men, it was to confront the broader failures that allowed such abuses to persist. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders, but it also reignited her determination. The next day, as she walked into the courtroom, Maya's resolve was unshakable. The struggle was deepening, but she was ready to face it head-on. This case was no longer just about her experience. It was about shining a light on a broken system and refusing to let darkness win. The courtroom was charged with anticipation as the final day of testimony began. Every seat was filled, the gallery overflowing with spectators who had followed the case closely. The air was thick with the weight of what was to come. Judge Maya Monroe's presence at the bench commanded silence as she scanned the room, her expression unreadable but focused. The prosecution's final witness was Lucas Carter, a young man whose encounter with officers Mark and Ryan had left him physically bruised and emotionally scarred. He took the stand, his hands trembling as he adjusted the microphone. Maya could see the nervousness in his eyes, but there was also resolve. "Mr. Carter," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the events of the night you were detained by officers Mark and Ryan?" Lucas's voice was shaky at first, but as he recounted the events, it grew stronger. "I was walking home from a friend's house. It was late, but I wasn't doing anything wrong. They pulled up beside me, got out, and told me to put my hands on the car. I asked why, but they didn't answer. They just pushed me against the car and started searching me." The gallery murmured, the tension palpable. "Did you comply with their orders?" the prosecutor asked. Lucas nodded. "Yes, but it didn't matter. They kept saying I looked suspicious. One of them said I fit the description of someone who'd committed a robbery. I told them I had just left my friend's place, but they didn't believe me." "And what happened next?" Lucas took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "They slammed me to the ground. My face hit the pavement, and I couldn't breathe. They put cuffs on me and kept me there for what felt like forever. When they finally let me go, they didn't even apologize. They just told me to watch myself." The prosecutor allowed the silence to hang in the room before continuing. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. No further questions." When the defense attorney rose, he attempted to poke holes in Lucas's testimony. "Mr. Carter, isn't it true that the area you were walking through is known for criminal activity?" Lucas stiffened but held his ground. "I don't know about that. I just know I wasn't doing anything wrong." "And yet, you admit it was late at night, and you were alone?" Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Since when is walking home a crime?" The gallery stirred again, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. The defense attorney's line of questioning faltered, and he quickly wrapped up. After Lucas stepped down, the prosecution rested its case, leaving the defense to present its closing argument. The defense attorney's tone was measured, almost pleading. "Your Honor, we are not arguing that mistakes weren't made. But mistakes are not crimes. Officers Mark and Ryan acted under the belief that they were doing their duty. They made split-second decisions in difficult circumstances." Maya listened intently, her face a mask of impartiality, but her mind weighed every word. The defense's argument leaned heavily on the idea of intent, a concept she knew could be a double-edged sword. Intent might excuse errors in judgment, but it did not absolve systematic bias. Finally, the time came for Maya to deliver her ruling. The gallery held its breath as she adjusted her glasses and looked out over the room. Her voice was calm but resolute. "This court has reviewed extensive evidence, heard testimony from multiple witnesses, and carefully considered the arguments presented by both sides," she began. "It is clear that the actions of officers Mark and Ryan were not isolated incidents. The patterns revealed in this case point to a troubling misuse of authority." She turned her gaze to the officers, who sat stiffly at the defense table, their faces pale. "The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve with fairness and integrity," Maya continued. "When that trust is broken, it damages not only the individuals directly involved, but the entire community. This court cannot and will not ignore that reality." A wave of emotion swept through the gallery. Maya paused, letting the weight of her words settle before delivering her decision. "Officers Mark and Ryan, this court finds you guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority. Your actions were not only unjustified but indicative of a deeper failure within the system you represent." The officers' heads lowered as gasps and whispers filled the room. Maya's voice remained steady as she continued. The court orders your immediate suspension without pay, mandatory participation in bias training programs, and inclusion on a disciplinary registry that will follow your professional record. Furthermore, this court recommends a thorough review of your past conduct by an independent oversight body. Her gavel struck sharply, signaling the end of the proceedings. This court is adjourned. As the room emptied, Maya remained seated, her hands resting on the bench. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she felt a glimmer of satisfaction. Justice, though imperfect, had been served. Before she left the courtroom, she glanced at Lucas, who stood near the exit. Their eyes met, and he nodded a silent thank you. Maya returned the gesture, her resolve renewed. This was not the end, but a turning point, a moment to spark lasting change in a system desperate for reform. The courtroom emptied slowly, the echoes of Judge Maya Monroe's ruling lingering in the air. Outside, the gallery's tension dissolved into a mixture of relief and quiet celebration. Reporters scribbled notes, activists exchanged smiles, and Lucas Carter stood with his family, holding his head a little higher than he had in weeks. Justice had been served, but its ripple effects were only beginning to unfold. Maya returned to her chambers, closing the door behind her and letting out a deep breath. She removed her robe, hanging it carefully on the back of her chair. The weight of the case had been immense, but so too was the satisfaction of seeing the law used to correct systemic wrongs. She glanced at the neatly stacked notes on her desk, a record of a trial that had already begun reshaping her understanding of justice. By the end of the week, the consequences of her ruling reverberated through the community. Officers Mark and Ryan's suspension was headline news, and their disciplinary review prompted broader scrutiny of the Fort Charleston Police Department. Calls for transparency grew louder as civic leaders, activists, and residents demanded reforms. Maya's actions had not gone unnoticed by her peers. At the State Judiciary Conference, her name was mentioned with respect, and her approach to handling the high-profile case was praised as a model of fairness and integrity. Yet for Maya, the accolades felt secondary. Her mind remained focused on the systemic changes that could emerge from this moment. One evening, Maya attended a town hall meeting at the community center. The room was packed with residents eager to discuss the trial's impact and what it meant for the city's future. She stood quietly at the back, blending into the crowd until a young woman approached her. "Judge Monroe," the woman said, her voice tentative but filled with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you. What you did gave me hope, for all of us." Maya smiled warmly. "Thank you. But this isn't just about me. It's about what we all can do to make things better." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We're organizing a community oversight board. Would you," she hesitated before finishing, "would you consider advising us?" Maya's heart swelled at the offer. "Of course. I'd be honored to help in any way I can." As the weeks passed, Maya worked with local leaders to implement meaningful reforms. A new community policing initiative took shape, and mandatory bias training was introduced for all officers in the department. Public forums became regular events, fostering dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they served. At home, Maya found solace in the quiet moments, reflecting on how the trial had changed her perspective. She framed a small clipping of a newspaper article, "Justice in Charleston, a Judge Stands Firm," and placed it on her bookshelf, a reminder of what was possible when courage met purpose. Months later, at the courthouse, Maya passed Lucas in the hallway. He was dressed sharply, carrying a briefcase, and greeted her with a bright smile. "Judge Monroe," he said, stopping to speak. I'm starting law school next fall. Watching you in court, it inspired me." Maya's smile widened. "You'll do great, Lucas. And remember, justice isn't just a career. It's a responsibility." As they parted ways, Maya's steps felt lighter. The trial was over, but its impact endured, in the city's reforms, in the lives it touched, and in the quiet determination of those who now believed that change was possible. Months after the trial, the city of Fort Charleston stood transformed. The courthouse steps, once a place of protests and demands for justice, now bore a new plaque that read, "Justice is not an ideal to be spoken of, it is a practice to be upheld." Beneath those words was the date of Judge Maya Monroe's landmark ruling. Maya sat in her chambers, a rare moment of stillness enveloping her. The framed newspaper clipping on her shelf caught her eye, a reminder of how one case had reshaped her city. But what lingered most in her mind wasn't the ruling itself, it was the people she had met along the way. Lucas Carter's decision to pursue law, the young woman organizing the Community Oversight Board, and the voices of those who had suffered in silence until now, each represented a thread in a tapestry of change. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with life. A group of high school students toured the building, their guide stopping to explain the significance of Maya's courtroom. One student lingered, staring at the bench where history had been made. "You're Judge Monroe, right?" the student asked as Maya exited her chambers. She smiled. "I am. What brings you here today?" "We're learning about justice," the student replied. "And about how one person can make a difference." Maya's heart swelled. "It's never just one person," she said gently. "Change takes all of us working together, believing that fairness and dignity are worth fighting for." The student nodded thoughtfully, and Maya watched as they rejoined their group, inspired by their curiosity and hope. As the sun set over Fort Charleston that evening, Maya joined a community gathering at the park where it all began. People of all ages and backgrounds shared stories, laughter, and a renewed sense of unity. Maya's presence was quiet but deeply felt, a symbol of resilience and progress. Looking around, she saw the faces of those who had fought alongside her, not in the courtroom, but in the collective push for accountability and change. The journey wasn't over, but it was moments like this that reminded her why it was worth continuing. In her heart, Maya knew that justice wasn't a destination. It was a path, one that she, her community, and those who would come after her were committed to walking together.